Hello and welcome to the Sports Pro podcast. Now, before we start the show, I just wanted to give you a little nudge to talk about our sister podcast. That is Streamtime Sports. It features my colleague Chris Stone and Sports Pro CEO Nick Meacham, and it's published weekly, covering all of the latest news and developments in the sports media space, with a special focus on the people, businesses and technologies driving the sports streaming revolution. It comes out every Wednesday and is the go-to place for broadcast professionals. Streamtime Sports wherever you get your podcasts. Hello and welcome to the Sports Pro podcast. This one is an exciting episode for a certain member of our panel today. Steve McCaskill loves talking about Man City's legal issues. Hello, Steve McCaskill.
I can't comment for legal reasons on your implication there, but I'm glad to be here.
Also in the studio is a bit more impartial Josh Sim. Hello, Josh.
Hello. I'm going to try my best to rein Steve in.
Can I just say that first and foremost, I am a journalist. That is my profession. So I am capable of analysing this subject with impartiality.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. Otherwise, we're going to get in a lot of legal hot water. As you may have guessed from that opening, today's show is going to focus, at least on the top part, about the tribunal hearing between Manchester City and the Premier League. This is the famous tribunal hearing, which is not the 115 charges. This is the one related to Manchester City's allegations of a tyranny of the majority in the Premier League, which I thought was interesting phrasing when that story broke a few months ago now. Maybe to give us a little bit of background, Josh, can you tell us what the announcement was on Monday, and then we'll take it from there?
Okay, so I guess going back to June, I think it was sort of emerged. Man City decided to sue or initiate legal action against the Premier League. And their sort of argument for doing so was they were targeting the associated party transaction rules, which are rules the Premier League set up to block clubs from entering commercial deals with companies that are associated with their ownership, i.e. in the case of City, Etihad Airways, all sorts of sort of companies that are associated with the United Arab Emirates ruling family who own Man City, or at least a member of them owns Man City. They took legal action against those rules, basically called them anti-competitive. They said it stifled their on-field success. It was discriminatory against clubs who were owned by owners based in the Middle East. Those were sort of some of the points they threw out there. So a legal tribunal has been looking at their case, and obviously the Premier League have argued against them. And on Monday, it was confirmed or announced by both sides that, well, it's confusing. Both sides claimed victory, basically, in this ruling that was announced on Monday. Manchester City said that two aspects of the rules were deemed unlawful by the tribunal, and that therefore all the APT rules void. The Premier League, however, have briefed a lot of people that the vast majority of City's grievances were found to be wrong, that the majority of the rules are indeed lawful, and that the rules are necessary as a result. So I guess that's sort of setting the scene of what's sort of emerged on Monday and how we got to that point. And then, yeah, I feel like that there's a lot more to come for sure.
Yeah, there's been an interesting fallout, actually. The very technical things that sort of basically City used to justify their claim of victory in this case were on, I think it was just two of the aspects of the associated party transaction, APT rules. Let's go with APT for the rest of the pod for the sake of everyone's time, of which I think there was more than 20 overall that they were contesting. Steve, what were the two that City basically were able to get ruled in their favour in terms of their challenges?
Well, the big one was that the rules were unlawful because they didn't take into account interest-free shareholder loans, which have traditionally been used by club owners as a way to inject capital into the club. These are interest-free, so they're not deemed to be paid back. They're often not really called in by the owners until they sell up. And it's been a traditional way for clubs to provide investment. Equity is another way to do that. And I guess City were arguing that because the rules didn't take that into account, what's different between a sponsorship deal with an associated party and an interest-free shareholder loan? That seems to be more advantageous for the club, a loan that is, because there's no interest being charged. They can put whatever they want. And that was one of the things that were upheld by the court.
the club that I support, Brighton. The club paid off, I think it was about £30 million to Tony Bloom, who's injected more than £400 million in the club since he bought it. That went towards building things like our stadium, our new training ground, which is for both the men's and the women's team, as well as just sort of other costs associated with running what was then a League One club and then became a Championship club and is now a Premier League club. And for the first time, upon making such a substantial profit last year, Brighton paid off some of that. But this argument essentially says that those kind of loans, which are, as you said, very favourable to the clubs involved, now have to be accounted for as part of these APT rules.
Yeah, so I think we'll probably talk about this in a second, but a City would believe that if fair market value should be applied to commercial arrangements, why is fair market value not applied to these? There's a term for it, but it's a more euphemistic term. These interest-free loans, and the other thing that they were also arguing this successfully, one was that the rules place the burden of proof on the club agreeing the deal, and it's difficult to prove whether a sponsorship deal was market value because the value of these deals isn't publicly available for various reasons. It's commercially sensitive, just there's not a reporting process in place. So at the end of the day, what constitutes a fair market value is very hard to ascertain. Of course, there's estimated values, that are released to the media. We have a lot of these in our commercial guides, things like that. We hear through the grapevine.
Great plug, Steve.
I told you I'm a professional at the start. So, but there's not a centralized database, which makes it hard for clubs to prove either way what is fair value. And that was another thing that was ruled in their favour.
Yeah, currently those fair market values are judged by the Premier League internally. I think they use Nielsen data, Nielsen Sports. And what essentially this ruling means is that it's going to be easier for Manchester City to basically get deals approved by the Premier League. Premier League will still have to approve those deals and judge that they are of fair market value. But in theory, this should make it easier for City to get some of those signed off. And sort of the big one here really is that coming down the road is a very large renewal with, I think, City's largest sponsor, Etihad. And lots of the reporting suggests this has been held up by these relatively new APT rules. And now it looks like City are going to be able to renew, if not at the price that they wanted to, probably closer to it. We don't know what that figure is. That's not been reported anywhere that I have seen anyway. When you put it like that, Josh, that does seem like City have secured a bit of a victory there if it suddenly means they are able to kind of get the deal that they want done.
I guess it gives them license to sort of go to the league and say, we think this is what we think this arrangement is worth. And it's now hard for the Premier League to sort of go against that. So it is a victory for City in that sense that I guess they won't expect too much, or they'll anticipate less pushback, I guess, because of this ruling. They'll feel more empowered to sort of sign these deals. So in that sense, it's a win. I wonder whether they're trying to get these sort of deals done before there's obviously the other ongoing case regarding the 115 charges that started last month as well. So I wonder whether sort of getting that done and then sort of having that sort of sponsorship deal sort of in hand before facing whatever ramifications come out of the 115 charges case is something that's on their mind. But yeah, it does empower them to sort of be able to strike these deals now. And the Premier League's going to have to go back to, I think they're going to meet. I've already called an emergency meeting to sort of revise sort of their rules on this, because they'll probably have to do it with speed, I guess, if they want to, stop City from getting those sort of commercial deals done.
If they've got those kind of those 2 points overturned, I guess that there is a victory in there somewhere. But the fact that the remaining system of the league centrally judging these associated party transactions means that if the Premier League hasn't quite entirely got its full suite of powers that it wanted, it has, Steve, at least got the majority of them. And probably the most importantly, the whole principle of the fact that clubs are no longer able just to sign off deals at any kind of price that they see fit.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to note the APT rules are still in place and they're going to be revised. They're not being revoked. I mean, I think we can all agree that having data to judge these deals is a good thing, right? Like, if these are the rules in place, it is quite hard for clubs to ascertain what is a fair market value against other clubs. But at the same time, other clubs dealing with companies that aren't part of the same group are doing a market value because they are literally the market. Whereas if they're related, you're trying to simulate market negotiations. I think it's absolutely right. There should be data out there to judge it against, and that's fair. Secondly, the Premier League, the rules are intact. They're in place. They're going to be revised to take into account interest-free shareholder loans. Again, this is an extremely complex case. There's lots of interrelated processes going on. I don't think that's really going to have an impact on the other hearings that are going on. But what it has done, and a lot of clubs are going to be affected by this, City's rivals, in many cases, particularly Arsenal, which I think have loans to the like £200 million. So if Arsenal have to end up paying interest on those, not sweetheart deals, but they are extremely favourable terms.
Favourably termed loans,
favourable terms. It's going to have an impact on their own compliance with PSR rules, which is going to impact their ability to invest in playing staff. So in that regard, it is a victory for Man City because it's affecting their rivals. But in terms of the actual legislation, I don't think you can call it an absolute victory for City given the rules are in place, and the other victory that they've won seems quite reasonable anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's also probably worth noting that it's unlikely you'd think that they retrospectively apply those APT rules to loans that are already in existence, because it's almost like post-game VAR on those kind of transactions. Like if they're impacted going forward, then yeah, that's probably a fair consideration. But I don't think that they're going to be able to force those clubs to retrospectively apply that to ongoing PSR compliance. I think the other sort of side of this story that I wanted to touch on is the briefing side of it. It's been a really fascinating episode for me. For our non-UK listeners, there's been a real divide in the media about who's won this case. The Times, perhaps most prominently, have taken a very strong stance on this, that City were the victors, whereas otherwise the reporting that I've seen has been more measured. Taking the sort of the legal side out of this, what did you guys think about the way that this played out in the media? Steve, maybe I'll start with you.
Well, I think there's been a very strong briefing war going on. This whole battle was going to take place in the courts, but it's also taking place in the court of public opinion. That's probably not going to impact the outcome of the hearings, but public perception, especially in the world of football, means quite a lot, especially when some of the processes are unclear, and we don't even know where this hearing is taking place, do we? So there's a bit of secrecy to it. In terms of the Times, I find it, some of their standpoints, and it's quite astonishing. It hasn't really appeared to be as measured as other outlets. It appears like they are being briefed by Manchester City, just based on some of the things I could see. Martin Samuel has been particularly vocal on this issue, basically saying that the Premier League has overplayed its hand, PSR's in the bin, complaining about shareholder loans as comparable, and that this is all not necessarily a stitch up, but it's all, the rules are pointless and the Premier League isn't really doing properly. Interesting, this is Martin Samuel, who was frequently rallied against an independent football regulator, which would address some of these concerns that he might have over this whole case. So I'm not really sure what's going on there. So I found the coverage to be surprising. I'm a Times reader as well, so it's my paper of choice. I've just found it remarkably strange that it's been so overtly influenced by one way.
Josh, you're a student of journalism. It's been quite interesting to see. I guess the Times would say that their argument is PSL rules actually ultimately favour the bigger clubs in that they protect the established elite and make it much harder for the likes of, say, Newcastle or Aston Villa to break into that top four set. But even in that framing, it does seem odd that they would come out so strongly in this. I guess the sort of caveat to all of this, or the starting point to all of this, was that the original story on City challenging these APT rules was broken by the Times. So it's maybe just a case of protecting their original reporting.
Yeah, I think my concern, let's call it concern, is more to do with, as sort of Steve has alluded to, the columns about the whole case as opposed to the actual news reporting. Because I understand, and I'm aware, for people who don't do journalism, this is going to sound like a journalism class. Like those who are sort of in news reporting, obviously you get briefed by sides, and you convey those sides of the story, and you obviously try to balance. But being briefed, that's not new. But when it comes to like reading a column and feeling like that's sort of being concocted by someone else, or there's a heavy leaning one side over the other, that's where I sort of start tuning out. No offense, just because it then feels as though it feels planted, so to speak. And it was really like interesting reading Martin Samuel's sort of column and trying to work out, and because there was a lot of detail involved in that column that you wouldn't find in a column. Like columns are sort of mainly opinion based and sort of not reading off sort of a lot of like I don't know. It was very different reading his column and sort of being like, this doesn't feel like a column to me, when there was a lot of detail that could have easily been included in a news story.
Yeah, it's one area I think for our American listeners where British journalism differentiates slightly in the idea of what a column is. In the US, a column might typically be filled with quite a lot of background notes and reporting, whereas a column here is very much is usually an opinion piece. And Martin Samuel, I mean, he's been around quite a lot of the major British publications, but yeah, in recent years, his established style is to write very long, multi-part columns, which are mostly just opinion. But this was, it was a little bit different. And it generally supported a package from the Times, which was, it did seem quite slanted and was quite odd. I don't want to get too bogged down in the details of British media. Steve, you've got a final point to make on this?
I was going to say, I still think the Times is an excellent newspaper, and I think it does some excellent coverage. I think the tone has just been a little bit strange on this occasion. That's all.
Yeah, that's been reflected, I think, in the reaction of some other journalists in this space too. Before we move off of City, one thing I'd sort of think it's probably worth pointing out, as Josh mentioned it earlier, is there is still this pending case of the 115 Premier League breaches. The 115 number is it's really become quite a meme in recent months, which are, whilst not related strictly to this case, still have some crossover strands in that they relate to sponsorship deals and some of them relate to inflated prices. Of course, those are allegations yet unproven, but there is a sort of consistent thread here around the way that City have built up their rather sizable, now extremely large revenue streams. I guess we will see where that goes. Steve McCask predicting what for Manchester City next season?
I'm not predicting anything. I think it's really hard to see how this will pan out. What I do think is, I think it was another podcast. Sorry, there are no other podcasts. There's another podcast suggested that most casual observers are hoping for one extreme or the other, where there's no punishment dished out, or there's the ultimate punishment dished out. So that either way, there's people outraged and people celebrating. I think somewhere down the middle, isn't going to please anyone that has a vested interest. But I feel like that may be the ultimate outcome. But then I'm not an expert. I'm not privy to the case. So, but I think it's interesting. It's either outcome. There's going to be fallout. If City are dealt with harshly, there's going to be an almighty backlash. And if they aren't dealt with severely enough, there's been an almighty backlash from other clubs, and it's going to bring into question the whole concept of PSR, governance and everything. And in the middle, there's just going to be outrage from everyone. So yeah, that's the only prediction I'm making. People are going to be outraged.
When you say everyone, I don't actually know any City fans, so that'll be interesting to see if any come out of the woodwork. Right. That's enough for that section. Having just pissed off, let's say, our listenership in Manchester, or at least part of it. Right. Moving on from what is not a particularly fun topic to talk about to what is a much more wholly positive topic to talk about. And that is the recently announced end of season viewership figures and engagement numbers for the WNBA. I don't think anyone will be surprised to hear that they have broken records. Caitlin Clark's first year in the first regular season in the league has produced some pretty large numbers and some really sizable growth. Josh, can you spell out a little bit of that for us?
Yeah, so I guess we'll start. Big picture, the league have hit viewership records. They attracted more than 54 million unique viewers across their broadcasters, and should say the WNBA has multiple broadcasters. So they have the deal with ESPN that's tied to the NBA's rights deal. So some games are shown on ABC, some are shown on ESPN and ESPN2 respectively. They also have an agreement with CBS, so some games air there, and also on the Scripps Network ION, which is also sort of over the air. So you have a mix of cable, over the air.
And Amazon too, I believe, as well.
Yes, and Prime as well. And also on NBA TV, which is the NBA's own cable network. So overall, yeah, as mentioned, a lot more viewers, a lot more new viewers as well. More games sort of hit at least 1 million viewers in average viewership as well, a record 22 for the regular season. And all the broadcasters I've sort of mentioned have seen massive viewership jumps. I think CBS's was about 86%, ESPN's was about 170%, and ION was 133%. So all of them saw massive growth. Obviously, I don't want to associate it with one person, but obviously Caitlin Clark headlines a draft class with Angel Reese and Cameron Brink and all these young stars that have gained such a fandom during their college career that transitioned really well into the pro game. And not only has it sort of translated to viewership increase on like TV and stuff, but I feel like on social media and stuff, there's a lot more buzz. There's a lot more mentions of players and hashtags and engagement all around as well. So a really big step for the WNBA and a lot of really positive signs and as to where it can go from here.
Yeah, it's definitely a good news story, the WNBA this season. And like you said, been largely driven by a pretty strong draft class and some interesting personalities. It's really been a sort of rising tide lifts all boat kind of thing. We've now reached the postseason, and Caitlin Clark, while she did manage to get the Indiana Fever, along with her teammates, because they exist too, into the playoffs, they were not able to progress, which sort of in the aftermath of the Fever's exit, viewership numbers on the WNBA postseason have declined. Now, Steve, are you surprised about that, or is this really quite predictable?
I'm not surprised. I think the WNBA success hasn't been an overnight thing. It's been going for decades. Last season was a record season in many ways. This year, with the arrival of that draft class, headlined by Clark, has amplified that massively, bringing audience from the college game into professional ranks. There's going to be a lot of casual fans just want to see how Caitlin Clark does in the playoffs. She's a big draw. Similar things could have happened during the Women's March Madness tournament. People were wondering how they would cope without Caitlin Clark, but some of the audiences there would have been records in the other years. The playoffs have still got huge amounts of interest. The playoff game involving Clark was a record. I think the difficult thing is it is coming into a crowded part of the season. When the NFL starts, if you're up against the NFL, you're always going to have a hard time. I think that's something that Major League Baseball has had to deal with its postseason for the last few years. It's just a very crowded marketplace, but there's no denying that WNBA is on an upward trajectory. It will hope to increase its share of this part of the year moving forward, and it's just benefiting from years of long-term investment, a short-term boost from Clark and the rest of that draft class, and also just growing interest in women's sport in general and live sport. In the current media landscape, live sport is the only thing that guarantees you huge ratings. Basically, everything else is on demand or via streaming. So people are looking for these live events, and they're often given a lot more prominence, particularly as Josh was explaining on main networks and good time slots as well, and just even the process of being taken away from ESPN2 and being put on ESPN or ABC is going to improve matters, or being on CBS's main network. So I wouldn't be concerned with WNBA. I think, sure, a long-term challenge is to make the rest of the league as appealing as Caitlin Clark and Indiana. But, there's enough stars there, there's enough players there. There's not just this year's draft class either. There's an established cohort of players in there. And I think the future is really bright for WNBA, especially ahead of the new television deals. Well, I think it's 2 years' time.
Yeah, I think your analysis is largely correct there, Steve. They'll be seeking to extend the fan base for the league geographically with a couple of different new franchises coming in, one in Canada as well, which will also bring in not just additional TV revenue from a local deal there, which will get a big bump, but also in Portland, I think is the other expansion franchise, which will provide more places for stars to pop up, actually. I think one of the things with the WNBA it has had a problem with almost is that there's almost too much talent for the amount of teams that are currently in the league. You get a lot coming out of the US college system, and they can't all land on teams. So adding a couple of new ones it can only be a good thing. The challenge, and this is a challenge I think almost every sports property in the US has to deal with, is how do we program around the NFL? The NFL is a huge vacuum. And if you're trying to put your postseason up against even just regular season NFL, you really struggle. Josh, the NBA's solution to this was to shift their season around almost completely. I mean, this is quite historical. It wasn't always the case that the NBA finished when it does. Does the WNBA have to do something similar? Where's the window for the WNBA to kind of capitalize on this growth in interest?
The good news, and if you're an NFL viewer, you know that you pretty much just have to tune in on a Sunday and a Monday, and perhaps on a Thursday if your team's playing on Prime Video then.
Or if you're in Brazil, it's Wednesday. Later in the season, there's going to be a Black Friday, and during Christmas, there'll be a Saturday. So it's very hard to escape the clutches between basically September and February. No,
as you said, it's pretty much every holiday. But I guess because the WNBA starts their season in May, they've got a good jumping off point, because I guess that's sort of when the NBA, again, they're up against the NBA postseason, but that's sort of, there's a bit of crossover then, because obviously that's when you have peak basketball fandom coming up at that time of year. Obviously you have no NFL, you have no college football either. So I guess its starting point is there, and obviously MLB has just started, but MLB is such a long season that you can sort of jump into that. That's a good sort of jumping point, and you're not sort of doing much harm going in that in May. So I think its jumping off point is fine. Obviously, this year's been unique because of the Olympics. With the Paris Olympics, it meant they took a mid-season break, as have a lot of sort of sports that have taken place over the summer months. So whether next year we'd see a repeat is probably unlikely. They'd probably be able to play throughout July without having to do such a break again, and maybe they can get sort of their season done a few weeks sooner, a month sooner, hopefully. So from that perspective, I don't think they'll have to do too much reworking. But yeah, I guess it is tough that it's postseason. And obviously, you mentioned the 2 expansion teams, it's going to mean more games are going to be added to the season as well, more weeks. The season's going to be expanded. So it's a challenge for sure. But I don't think it needs to sort of move away. I think it's targeting a different fan base from the NFL, to be honest, as well. And I don't think it needs to sort of necessarily move off the NFL. I know the NFL have obviously got Taylor Swift and her fans pumping up and adding that sort of new demographic, but that might be considered a similar demographic to what the WNBA targets. But I think it goes after different people, I think, and a different sort of demographic of people. And I think it's good enough to sort of stand off on its own feet and sort of brave it against the NFL, because again, they cater for different audiences and different groups of people.
I think it's absolutely in the right time for year at the moment. I mean, the season's quite short compared to other leagues, but it starts pretty soon after Women's March Madness, which means you get that immediate momentum continuing in from the college side. As Josh said, this year was slightly affected by the Olympics. It is going for a different audience, I believe, to other sports, including the NFL. It's going, fans of women's sport, fans of basketball. By having that different part of the calendar, you can almost have a year round of basketball, which I think is appealing. Most sports struggle against the NFL, and if you are targeting a different section of the audience, then you might have better luck. And I just looked up the first game between the Indiana Fever and Connecticut Sun in the WNBA playoffs went up against the NFL, and it still drew 1.84 million viewers. That's really good. Like for a night with the NFL, that is excellent. And game 2, which was a record, was 2.5 million. So that's only an extra 700,000, which you could explain by the fact on a Wednesday night, or you could explain by the fact it's if they don't win, they're out, and it could be the last we see of Clark in the playoffs. So there's star appeal, and there's also real opportunity there. So yeah, I think shifting it to another part of the year is just going to be a challenge. You don't want to shorten the season. You want to prolong it, build up the season, the regular season. Look what the NBA's done, year-round basketball. I think it's fine.
Okay, Stephen Castle's made a ruling. For the final part of this show, Steve is going to get out his top hat. A man of the people, a man of technology, a man of intellect, but he's now become a member of the elites, and tell us all about why we should care about the America's Cup.
I mean, I'm not going to claim to be a sailing aficionado, and I just from what I'm about to talk about, I interviewed the chief executive of America's Cup event, Grant Dalton, as part of the interview will be on Sports Pro, but we're also doing a tech stack on the America's Cup, which will be an overview of the technological and broadcast operation of the oldest continuous international sporting event in the world, first held in 1851. So it's not an elite event. It's one of the original sporting events. It's one for the people. But I ran it through Otter, which if you don't know that, it's basically a transcription service, and it now does AI summaries. And it said, it really sold me down the river. It said, Steve discusses his limited experience with sailing, chatting to the chief executive of the America's Cup. So I just thought I'd share that tip before I get into it. But yeah, so the America's Cup starts this week. It's been the preliminary rounds have been going on for several weeks now. It's part of an ongoing process. And the headline is that a team from the UK is competing in the America's Cup for the first time in 60 years, which is quite an achievement. It's the culmination of several years of investment and development by the Ben Ainslie-led syndicate, which initially started out trying to win the 2017 America's Cup in Bermuda under the Ben Ainslie Racing moniker. It's now part of the Ineos Sporting Empire, and they won the qualifying event, the Louis Vuitton Cup, which was competed by 5 teams. And it does feel as though this year's event is a bit bigger than previous years. I mean, the 2013 America's Cup, which is the only one I've attended. I'm not a big sailing fan, as discussed, despite your protestations.
He's not a big sailing fan, but he's been to America's Cup and he's been to SailGP events. And now he's talking about what the relevance of this in 2024. It's a strong argument.
I was attending a tech conference in 2013, and the America's Cup happened to be on. I went to a cloud storage conference, not very sailing-y. But that was a watershed moment. And, again, the fact of the tech conference sort of epitomizes the point I was trying to make, in that was Larry Ellison bringing it to San Francisco. The America's Cup is unique in that there's not a formal organizing committee. It's all governed by something called the Deed of Gift, which is essentially a contract that you have to interpret. And it basically gives control over the event to the defending champion. And so Larry Ellison decided that he wanted carbon fiber catamarans racing around San Francisco Bay, really high speed, really great backdrops, turning it into a true television event. And of course, being in Silicon Valley, there was lots of technical innovation. And so that was a big milestone for the event. But that was more than 10 years ago. We had the America's Cup in Bermuda, didn't really make the same splash. We've had a couple of dog matches, which are essentially hostile challenges for the Cup. They're not a formal challenge. And we had COVID. So this is a big event. It's in Europe, which means it's great for time zone, which is something that Grant Dalton was telling me, which is really good for commercial reasons, more sponsors, more viewers. They're targeting, I think it's 1 billion viewers or 1 billion reach. It's 1 billion something, basically.
I think sports properties these days love to leave that open, whether when they're talking about reach and eyeballs and viewers. They can be interchangeable depending on who they're trying to sell to at any given point.
But it is based on Nielsen data, apparently, so there is that.
A lot of plugs for Nielsen data today. They're not paying us, by the way, yet.
They really should, shouldn't they? This podcast is brought to you, but no. So what technology on North America? Obviously, there's a lot of technology on the water in terms of the boat, but sailing is quite a difficult sport to understand. I mean, I don't really know what's happening without a guide. Again, insert Tom Bassam quote about me being a sailing expert. So I really rely on the coverage in terms of the graphics on the water, and why, if you watch a race and they're going to the gates or the buoys, they often go in different directions because they're chasing the wind. Of course, I don't really know what's happening. So this year they're introducing wind graphics. You can see in real time where the wind's going, and that's going to be transformational. The event is going to be broadcast. TV isn't a revenue stream for the America's Cup. It's a cost, because they, to get the level of coverage that they need to have lots of hours, which means it goes behind a paywall if they want to get some money for it, which means no one's going to watch it, essentially.
Helicopters as well required?
Helicopters. They've got the women's race to put on. They've got youth races to put on. There's a lot of requirements. For them, the whole point is to be as available as possible, because they want to promote sailing. They want to keep the America's Cup going. Sponsorship becomes hugely important as well, having wide availability. I think the racing is available on YouTube. It's available on the website. So it's a really interesting operation in terms of when you compare it to other sports, in that TV is not the main source of revenue. It's commercial revenue. The technology really is instrumental in making it a TV event. If you just stick 2 boats out on the water, not that people are going to understand it, but if you put, if the graphics go down on football, most people are going to know what they're seeing. And as I said, if our digital platform goes down, we don't have a race, basically. It's also difficult for the teams to do it themselves. So it is a really fascinating use case from a technological and a commercial standpoint. They're shifting away from luxury sponsorship. That's always been a strong suit for them. I mean, it's Louis Vuitton Cup, for example. So they're looking to broaden the appeal of that. Barcelona, again, great city, great backdrop. So there's more of a buzz this year. I think it's really interesting as a business story. And yes, I'll have an interview on the site and the tech stack, which, if you haven't read a tech stack, I really urge you to check them out. They are really good sort of primers for what's going on in the world of technology. And I'll be tuning in. I think, apart from the England men's football team winning a major international tournament, it feels like the America's Cup is one of the last things that we haven't won now after that glorious decade from the 2010s and the 2000s with the couple of World Cup victories. So, yeah, I think there'll be a lot of eyes. I think there might be some mainstream coverage, certainly here in the UK.
All right. Always good to get in a plug for humble billionaire Jim Ratcliffe's projects as well. Thank you very much, Steve McCaskill. Josh is smirking. He's also written a few of those tech stacks, and as Steve said, I can concur, they are excellent. Yeah, really good understanding of what goes into giving a sports property life, because largely these days that is technology. I should point out that if you want to access those tech stacks, you do have to be a Sports Pro Plus member. Podcast listeners can get 10% off a Sports Pro Plus membership if they sign up for an annual pass. That's using code podcast10 at checkout. That's code podcast10 at checkout. All the usuals, terms and conditions apply, etc., but it's a good deal. You'll get access to tech stacks, commercial guides, our in-depth media hub, our wire service covering all the breaking news stories from across the industry, much, much, much more. It's a really great product, and I would say that because they pay my wages, but don't take my word for it. Go and check it out. Steve, Josh, thank you very much for all your nuanced opinion and conversation today. Steve, I'm very impressed at your restraint in not predicting that Pep Guardiola will be managing in the National League next season. And Josh Sim, thank you very much for your cutting analysis of the whole picture.
Thank you very much for your attempted character assassination, Tom. Always a pleasure.
That's what I do best.
Thanks, Tom. I think the Sports Pro Plus subscription is fair market value. Tie it all together.
That's a great way to end the pod. Thank you, Josh.